Who's going to help me with review? Who remembers what happened in 1 Samuel 18? Someone got married. That's all the girls remember. There's a wedding. Yay.
David killed 200 Philistines.
David did kill 200 Philistines. The men remember the deaths. Yeah, people died. Someone got married. That pretty much sums up the chapter, right? Okay, so chapter 17 was David and Goliath, and at the end of chapter 17, Saul just loves David. He's the best. Chapter 18 comes around, and David starts getting more glory than Saul does. And people love David, and Saul gets jealous, and Saul is now worried that David's going to take the kingship. And Saul is afraid of David. And so Saul, first thing Saul does is he tries to kill David in the palace with his spear. That doesn't work. So then Saul tries to put David in the army. Maybe David, being a young kid, isn't going to do well in the army. David does great. So then Saul tries to put him in battle, and maybe the Philistines are going to kill him, and that turns out terrible because David does great. So then Saul tries to get David to fight more aggressively against the Philistines, hoping the Philistines will kill him by offering a couple daughters to him for his wife. And David is even more valiant and does great, and that doesn't work either. And Saul is just having no success of getting rid of David. In fact, everything he does makes David have more success and be more beloved by the people. And it almost seems like God is just bringing David great success because, God is bringing David great success because that's God's goal here. And so Saul in chapter 18 was kind of playing the roundabout part of trying to get David killed. I'll have David go fight, and maybe the Philistines will kill him. Well, Saul's not going to be quite that, what's the term I'm looking for? Subtle, yes, that's the word I was looking for. Not as subtle with his attacks against David in chapter 19. So I titled that Saul continues to persecute David. So we're going to see Saul gets much more blatant and much more aggressive against David here. Let's go ahead and open in prayer, and then we'll dive right in. Ted, will you open us in prayer?
Okay, Father, we just thank you for the day and this teaching that we're about to have. I just pray that you would just all have us stay awake and pay attention and be willing to learn and pray.
Yeah. So 1 Samuel 19, verses 1 through 3. Jonathan, you want to read?
Now Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighting greatly in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, My father Saul seeks to kill you. Therefore, please be on your guard until morning, and stay in a secret place and hide. And I will go out and stand beside my father in a field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. Then what I observe I will tell you.
So Jonathan warns David. Saul is done with being subtle. So Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all his servants that they should kill David. He's just straight out now. We got to get rid of David. He's done. We got to kill him. He doesn't know his son very well, does he? Because what's Jonathan's first thing he does after he hears about Saul's plan? He turns around and goes tells David, David, we have a problem. So Jonathan, it says here, Jonathan delighted greatly in David. Jonathan loves David. And remember last week, we saw in the first part of chapter 18 that Jonathan and David made a covenant together. Again, I think this covenant was that Jonathan basically said, I'm going to support you as being the next king. I'm going to renounce my right to be king as the king's son, and I'm saying that I'm going to support you as being the king because God has chosen you and God's anointed you, and I am going to follow the Lord in this instead of following what normally would be my hereditary right to be king. And so I think this goes along with that. Jonathan's sticking with his covenant and says, I'm for David, and even though my dad's the king, I know David's going to be the next king, so I'm going to go to David and warn him because that's part of what I promised to do here. And so Jonathan delights greatly in David, so he reports Saul's plan to David. So he tells David several things. Number one, my dad plans to kill you. So be on your guard. That's probably a good idea. Until morning. So apparently Saul's plan was this day, we're going to kill him right now, immediately. This isn't like a long-term plan. This is like, let's get him now. So he tells him to stay in a secret place and hide. Go find a place to hide. And then I'll go speak with my father about you, and I'll tell you what happens. I'll tell you what the response is. So he warns David first, even before he goes and speaks with his father. And you're going to see he makes a very good speech to his father, too. But the first things first, he gets David out of harm's way before he even goes and speaks with his father. And so Jonathan goes and warns David. And I think this is part of what Jonathan promised to do with David last chapter, is that I'm going to support you. I'm going to do everything I can to help you become the king. And even though that means I don't get to become king, that's fine, because I'm trusting God with this, and that God has picked you out, and I'm in support of that. And it shows Jonathan's great faith here and his great love for God, that he's picking God's plan over what could benefit him. And so, again, Jonathan is just this neat guy, and it's really sad to see how Jonathan's life ends because of, again, how Saul's sin affected even Jonathan, who was a man who loved God, but his life was cut short because of his father and his inability to follow God and obey him. God could have really used Jonathan in a great way, I think, if it wasn't for Saul. But that's my own commentary, so you can take that for what that's worth. Let's move on. Verses 4 through 6. Nathan.
Thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, Let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good towards you. For he took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine, and the Lord brought about great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without a cause? So Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, As the Lord lives, he shall not be killed.
So Jonathan defends David to Saul. Number 2 here. And this is, I want to spend a little time on this. This is just a great speech here. So Jonathan speaks well of David. Sure did. First of all, he starts out, let not the king sin against his servant. So he identifies here, first of all, that Saul and what he's planning on doing is first of all, a sin against David. And he's going to tell him why it's a sin against David. But you're doing something that's wrong against this person, David. What you're planning here is not right at all. So Saul should not sin against David. And why? Because David has not sinned against you. What David has done for you has been righteous. All this time that you've been against him, and you've tried to kill him, and you've tried to trap him, and you've done all these bad things, David has done nothing wrong against you. He's always behaved righteously. He's always behaved wisely. He's not sinned against you, and you're trying to kill him. Why are you even doing this? So David has not sinned against Saul. David's works, in fact, have been... It's not even been ambivalent. David's works have been good towards Saul. Everything David's done has helped Saul out, has helped Saul secure his kingdom, has helped Saul win battles, has helped Saul be a better king. David served faithfully as a commander in Saul's army. Everything that David's done has helped Saul. And Saul's been jealous of that because Saul's not getting the glory for it. And Jonathan's saying, this guy has done nothing but serve you and make your kingdom better, make your kingdom more secure, has defeated your enemies, and you're the one that's sinning against him. David has even, verse 5 here, he says, for he has took his life in his hands and killed Philistines. David has given his life to serve Saul. He's put himself in harm's way to kill Saul's enemy, the Philistines. Remember last week when Saul sent David out to get the 100 foreskins, he said, go and take vengeance on my enemies. It's Saul's enemies that David's fighting, and David's put himself in harm's way in a position where he could have been killed to kill Saul's enemies. So he's given his life to serve Saul. And then the best part here, and the Lord has brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. The Lord has fought on behalf of David, on David's side. The Lord has used David and his service to Saul to bring about a great deliverance for Israel. Why have the Philistines suffered these great defeats. Who defeated Goliath? What was happening before David came on the scenes with Goliath? Not much. There was a 40-day standoff there, that nothing was going on. What happened after David killed the Goliath? There was a slaughter. The Israelites routed the right? And who did David give credit to? He came up to David and said, I'm doing this because I want everybody to know that this day that the battle is not won with the sword and the spear and the javelin, but the battle is the Lord's, and that there is a God in Israel who can deliver his people from you Philistines. And it's because of David that the Lord is delivering it, and not because of David, it's because of the Lord doing it, but it's David who God is using to have these great victories in Israel to secure them from the Philistines. And Jonathan's saying, why are you killing the guy who's making your kingdom so secure and who the Lord himself is using to give Israel more security than they have had in many, many years, probably since the beginning of your reign, Saul, when you were actually serving the Lord and winning battles. That's probably the last time that Israel has been this secure. The Lord has fought for David. And then the last thing he says, why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without cause? Why are you doing this? Why are you going to kill an innocent guy? And Saul actually listens to Jonathan at this point. He listens. Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, and we'll see how long this lasts for him. But it says, as the Lord lives, he shall not be killed. Now, the interesting thing is that his actions don't follow through with this. We'll see in just a second that this didn't last long in Saul's mind. But the results do follow through this, because did Saul ever kill David? No. So while his intent was not following through with what he said, in a sense he's a little bit prophetic in that, David's not going to get killed by Saul. Saul's not going to finish him off. And so it's funny that God kind of honors his words here, and as the Lord lives, he shall not be killed. Well, God says, he's not going to be killed. Not by you, Saul. I'm not going to let that happen. So Jonathan defends David to Saul. Just a great speech on Jonathan's part, and he really gets to the heart of the issue here. David has done everything right. He's done nothing against you. In fact, he's been used of God, and God has used him in a great way. Why are you going to kill this guy who's innocent of anything deserving of death? Why are you going to go ahead and do something so evil and so wicked, Saul? You are the king of Israel. You're God's representative. Why are you doing this? And it gets to Saul, and for one moment at least, Saul says, you're right. I'm not going to do it. Let's move on. So 1 Samuel 7 through 8. Jana. I forgot to pass this out, Nathan, so you can hand that back or whatever. David. Now, what happened right before this? What did Jonathan? What did Jonathan tell David? Saul's trying to kill you. And now what's David doing? He's going back and serving Saul again. He's just kind of sick of what's going on with You see his tune. Here is like, you probably can't even bet on David because like he's like a sure gonna win. And kill him again. David's let it go and do this in the world to fight. You know, so what if Saul's trying to? God can protect me from that. Into me, because I would have had it by this point. I would have been like, out of here. You're going to see that David to play the harp again for Saul. You know, not only he does. So So here we see Saul tries to kill David again. Yeah, the evil spirit again comes upon Saul. So as before, they called David in because this has worked in the past. And the evil spirit comes upon Saul while he sat in his house. Now it's interesting. You know, before this, David was out fighting. Saul, the commander of the army, the guy who's supposed to be delivering Israel, is in his palace. If you remember, and we're going to talk about this when we get to 2 Samuel, but I remember when David sinned with Bathsheba, that passage starts out, it was a time when the kings went out to war, that David was in his palace. Well, what's David at that time? He's a king, and what were the kings doing? They were running out to war, but David didn't. So David wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing. I have a feeling Saul's really not where he's supposed to be doing. He's supposed to be out leading the armies. And Saul's not. So again, if Saul's jealous of David's victories and David getting all the glory, Saul maybe should be out doing something other than sitting in his palace. But he's in his palace, and David comes back because the distressing spirit, the evil spirit, is upon Saul. So he sat in his house. He has a spear in his hand. You know, again, if I'm David, here's the king with an evil spirit and a spear in his hand. I've seen this story before. This is like Saul kills David part 2, the second part of the movie here. And David is playing the harp, and Saul tries to pin David to the wall once again. The commentators say that as he does this, you know, as David escapes and dodges it or whatever, they think that probably Saul got thrust the spear so hard that it got stuck in the wall, and that's why David was able to escape here. And so David escapes, and he fleds and escapes into the night. Well, where does David go? Let's find out. Who wants to read? Hannah. So Michael saved. Remember, the two kids, they both love David. And again, Saul doesn't seem to realize well, he knew about this, though. He knew that she loved him. But I asked you, where did David go? Well, David went home when he flees. So Saul sent messengers to David's house. You can put an E on there if you feel like you need it to be spelled right. It's David's house to kill him. And so Michael plans, and I spelled Michael wrong there too. Wow. There's where the E went. The E dropped into the next line. So, yeah. So pull that E out of there. Michael plans is, Okay, the next point. Michal plans to escape for David. She's going to let him escape through the window. Apparently there weren't a ton of messengers because they didn't surround the house. Now, this could be like, remember Jericho when the spies came into Jericho and they stayed in Rahab's house and she dropped out through the window. The window was in the wall, so it could have been a house in the wall of the city, and so maybe it was out into the outside of the city, out through the wall. That could have been where David's house was in the city. We're not sure. That could be possibly why he could get out through the window. And so she put, and I couldn't think of a good word here, so I used duplicate, but like I wanted to say dummy in the bed, but no, dummy didn't sound right in there, yeah. But the word is image, this image that she put in the bed is a teraphim. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the word teraphim. It's a word I've heard before. Some of you may have heard of it, but teraphim is a kind of idol. It's an object of reverence, a means of divination. So this would have been a full-sized, human-sized idol that was in the house. And she used that and put that in the bed and used a cover of goat's hair. Some people said that this, when they slept at this time, they used this cover of goat's hair to kind of put over their eyes to kind of block out the light, kind of like a sleep mask almost, that they would cover their face to block out the light during the morning hours or whatever so they could sleep longer. But at any rate, so this idol was in the bed, and the goat's hair was there kind of maybe looking like hair or whatever. And she tells the men that David is sick. And the men buy it, and they go back to Saul and say, we can't get him, he's sick. Saul doesn't care. He'll kill a sick man just as well as he'll kill a well man. So he says, bring him back to me in the bed, I'll kill him that way too. He might not. That might make it easier for him. If he's sick, he can't escape out of the bed. So Saul says, bring him back in the bed. I'll kill him that way. So the messengers get there and they say, we'll just grab the whole bed and bring the whole bed with him in it. And that's when they discover the deception. And so Saul's angry, and he's willing to kill David. Maybe he's even willing to kill his own daughter at this point. And so he starts questioning Michal and says, why have you deceived me like this? Why have you sent my enemy away so that he's escaped? And so she lies. And I think, you can be kind of harsh on her and say, well, she shouldn't have lied. She should have told the truth. But you have a raving, mad, evil spirit-possessed type of king questioning you who's not only able to but willing to kill people just because he's jealous and he's mad. What do you do at this point?
House divided. You have a wife of the person, and you have the father of the person. You're in the middle, and
Yeah.
Scripture did say that earlier that Michal loved
David, yeah.
For the sake of, you're not going to kill my husband.
Yeah. So
Also, we don't know that it's lies. It doesn't say what David says. There's somebody who's silent the whole time with you.
Well, the story here talks about it was her plan to save his life. So she came up with a plan. So it doesn't sound like that David and David.
But David wouldn't just go and then leave. He would say something.
Yeah. But her what she says here is he said to me, "Let me go. Why should I kill you?" That's saying that if you don't let me go, I'm gonna kill you. I don't think David said that to her.
But it could mean that he's still there. He doesn't know what Saul will do to him and fight for him out the whole house.
That's true, but I think here it's insinuating that David made a threat against her, and that's what she's saying to Saul to kind of save her own life. That I was threatened by David, he made me do it, as her defense to her dad, so that he doesn't kill her. I think that's where we're at here.
But it's not necessarily a lie. We don't know that for sure.
Okay, but that's her defense is that David threatened me, and I think it is a lie. I'm going to go with that. So,
Deception is a lie in form.
yeah. So I think she insinuates that David threatened her. I don't think David threatened her. I don't think the passage supports that David threatened her here. And again, I think we could be harsh on her and say that she sounds like she's lying to her dad. She's protecting her life at this point, and it's a hard situation for someone who, again, is a stark raving mad king who's willing to kill an innocent guy what's he going to do to his wife, even if she is his daughter? And so she does what she feels like she has to protect her life. And we know that Saul lets her live through this because she shows up later on in the story. So whatever she did to protect her life here. Verses 18 to 21, let's move on. Miriam.
So David fled and escaped, and went to Samuel in Ramah, and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and stayed in Nacre. Now it was told to Saul, saying, "Take note, David is at Nacre in Ramah." And Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the group of prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as leader over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. And when Saul was told, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. Then Saul sent messengers again also.
I got off on the numbers here, didn't I? What do I have here? 1, 2, 3. I have 2 3s on there. So that should be 3 number 1. This should be 3 number 2. This should be 4. So, it's supposed to be automatic numbering on this word processing program, but computers are not all-knowing apparently. So Saul sends messengers to seek David, and they prophesy. So David goes to Samuel. He goes to Ramah. Why Ramah? That's Samuel's hometown. So Samuel, that's where he's living now. Spending any time with Saul because he told him he wasn't going to. Saul apparently doesn't have any time for Samuel either because he hasn't bothered to see him. And they go to Naioth. And Naioth is a place that the commentators are like, well, there's not really a place called Naioth. They think it's perhaps a dwelling place within Ramah. Maybe Naioth is the place where the prophets stay there. It's a separate kind of place. It would be like we're in Des Moines and there's the East Village. The East Village is a place within Des Moines. It's part of Des Moines. So Naioth might be a place within Ramah, and that might be Samuel's place where him and his prophet school is, which would be why all the prophets are there in this story. And so Saul sends messengers to take David there when he finds out that's where David is at. David, of course, I kind of skipped over that, but David widely goes to seek Samuel. Samuel's the guy that anointed him. Maybe at this point, he's like, Saul's just trying to kill me. Eventually, one of these times, just by luck, he might kill me, Samuel. What am I to do? You anointed me. I'm trusting God, but this is getting more difficult all the time because on this. He might be going to Samuel for advice here, and Samuel's like, okay, just stay here. We're okay. God's in control. So the messengers go there, and they see the group of prophets. They see Samuel leading them, and when they get there, they start prophesying. So they join the prophets and start prophesying. Well, that's not what they were sent to do. They were sent to get David. But they get stopped because the Spirit of God comes upon them, and they're prophesying. Well, that doesn't work, so Saul's like, I'm going to send another group. No, the second group gets there. They see the prophets. They see Samuel, and they start prophesying. They're not there to prophesy. They're there to go get David, but they don't ever get that far. They start prophesying. So Saul sends the third group, and the same thing happens again. And the messengers cannot complete their task because they can never get to David because the Spirit of God stops them. They can't complete their task because they're filled with the Spirit of God, and they start prophesying. So, I think it's even better. 1 Samuel 19, 22 to 24. Okay, Lemuel, I saw your hand the whole time, and I'll let you do the last one here.
Then he also went to Ramah and came to the great well at Persecute. So he asked and said, "Where are Samuel and David?" And someone said, "They are at Naioth in Ramah." So he went there to Naioth in Ramah. Then the Spirit of God was upon him also, and he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth in Ramah. And he also
said before Samuel, in like manner, and lay them naked all that day and all that night before they say, Saul also among the prophets.
So Saul seeks David and prophesies. So Saul goes to Ramah and Neath. The Spirit of God comes upon Saul, and he prophesies. He prophesies, in fact, so much that he strips off his clothes. Now, some people said he might not have been. This might have been him stripping off his armor and his royal garments and down to just the basic clothes. They're not very basic, naked, and he's all day and all night prophesying. And the people are amazed. They're like, is Saul also among the prophets? Now, what did Saul come there to do? He's trying to kill David, right? And the Spirit of God comes upon him, and he cannot kill David because he's, I'm going to say, use the word stuck, prophesying. That's what the Spirit of God has him doing. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So this is almost comical because Saul has this. In verse 6, remember, he says, the Lord lives, he shall not be killed. And despite all Saul's intention to break that oath that he swore, the Spirit of God makes sure that he does not break that oath. So interesting. So takeaways here. I want to look at these quick, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Saul, despite Jonathan's argument that what he was doing was wrong, continued to seek David's death. However, Saul could not fight against God's plan for David. When Saul sent messengers to Ramah, the Spirit of God overwhelmed them, and instead of carrying out Saul's plan, they prophesied. Even when Saul went to Ramah to kill David, he could not fight against God. Saul swore that as the Lord lives, he, David, shall not be killed. Even though Saul changed his mind, God stood by that oath and protected David. Nothing Saul did could change that. So here's my takeaway for us. Instead of fighting against God, we should seek to align our will to God and serve and follow him. Saul tried to fight God. Saul tried to fight God's plan, and there's nothing that Saul could do, even when his intent was completely to destroy David, to kill him, to eliminate David. That wasn't God's plan. And even when he sent his message, he himself went and probably had overwhelming military numbers and powers to go to Ramah to go kill David. God still had the upper hand and stepped in and put his spirit on Saul. And I wanted to say this too. Imagine Saul. Remember, Saul was a man when he first was anointed king. The Spirit of God came upon him. And what did he do when the Spirit of God came upon him? The first time he prophesied. But the Spirit of God came upon him and he won battles, right? And the Spirit of God came upon him and he did good things. Now he's trying to accomplish a task. His task is to kill David. Now the Spirit of God is coming upon him, and it's not helping him to accomplish his task. It's hindering him from accomplishing his task. Now he's a man, instead of the Spirit of God helping him and working for him, the Spirit of God is fighting against him. Imagine that in your life, that you're trying to do something and God is fighting against you. Yeah. And where you're at is Saul. I mean, being afraid of David, but now you see God's Spirit comes upon you, and now you can't do what you were planning on doing. Now you can't do what you thought was the ultimate purpose of. And God's not letting you do that. Imagine where you're at as Saul in your mind at that point. This should be a point where Saul really stops and says, my life is way out of whack. I'm off 80 degrees from where God wants me to be. I need to turn. This should be a moment of reflection, of confession, of repentance. And he doesn't do. But this should really, if nothing else, open up Saul's mind to where he's at. This should really force him to say, hey, I'm really nowhere near where God. And yet he doesn't see that. And for us, we shouldn't be fighting against God. If God is fighting against us, we need to really think, are we really where we want to be? Or do we need to get ourselves back on track and get right with God and repent and start to do? So we need to align ourselves with God's will and serve and follow him. So that's number one. Number two, when Jonathan went to Saul to defend David, he argued based on David's character. Remember, what has David done? David hadn't sinned against God. In fact, he's been doing good for Saul. In fact, he gave his life to serve Saul. In fact, the Lord was working through him to save Israel, give Israel this great victory. In fact, he's been innocent of anything deserving of death. That was Jonathan's argument. He argued based on everything that David was doing and how David lived his life, how David interacted with Saul. He argued based on David's character because David had been faithful to Saul and to the Lord, and because David had behaved wisely. Remember, last chapter, it kept on coming up. David behaved more wisely than Saul's servants. He behaved wisely over and over again. So I asked this question, and I asked it to myself as much as to all of us here. If someone had to defend you, what kind of argument would they use to defend you with? Could they say, Pastor Jim, yeah, why are you it's never done against always served you, always done what's right. In fact, the Lord has used. Is that the kind of argument? And I'm just pick, yeah. And if they can't use that kind of argument, they can't look at you and say those kind of things, then let me argue there's areas of improvement in your life that, okay, let's make ourselves that kind of person that those kind of arguments that were used of David can be used of us if somebody had to defend us in our life. So I think David's testimony is just a beautiful testimony, and Jonathan could go to Saul and say, look, there's nothing against him. He has not sinned against you. In fact, everything he's done has been good to you. Everything he's done to you has been right to you. Everything he's done to you has been beneficial to you. And everything he's done has been used of the Lord to not only help you out, but to help the whole nation out. What a testimony David had. So those are my two takeaways this morning. Any thoughts or questions?
I wonder what Saul prophesied.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what some of the things were.
Like David live long or something like that.
David's a good guy.
Yeah. David's going to take over for me. David's a better man than I am. Yep, I don't know. That's
always been a puzzle to me. Here God put it in one verse, says God gave him an evil spirit. And then in another verse he says he gave and very much in contradiction to each other. And it almost reminds me of what's in Galatians, where the spirit wars against the flesh and flesh against the spirit.
interesting enough, I forgot to point this out in the passage. This is the very last time in 1 Samuel that the Spirit of God comes upon Saul. He never again experiences God's Spirit in his life. And this time it was not a situation where God empowers him to do a task for him. This is a time where God's Spirit comes upon him to stop him from doing something that God didn't want him to do. And so it was almost the Spirit coming in, smacking him in the head and saying, stop, you can't do this. And that's really not what you want the Spirit in your life to do, to stop you from doing things. You want the Spirit to empower you and give you the strength to do what God wants you to do, not to stop you from doing something foolish and evil and sinful against God. Obviously the Spirit helps us not to do sinful things, but if that's the only reason the Spirit's there, then we gotta start thinking about how we're acting and how we're living for God. So
what's our excuse?
we have the Spirit always. Lynn, will you close us in prayer?